My daughter told me her stepdad was more of a father than I ever was. She said it at a family dinner in front of everyone. Her mom, my ex-wife, didn't blink. She just smiled in agreement. I swallowed it, paid for dessert, went home. The next day, what happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% of our viewers who click on the like button. This really makes us happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. Now let's get into the details of the story. I always believed the worst pain comes quietly, slipping in through the spaces you thought were sealed and settling somewhere soft before you notice it's become a part of you. But that night, the pain didn't sneak in. It walked straight up to me, pulled out a chair, and introduced itself in front of an entire restaurant. I can still see the dim amber lighting, the flicker of the candle between us, and the way my daughter's face looked almost bored when she said it. 16 years old, sharp and certain, she stabbed her fork into a piece of chicken parmesan and said, loud enough for the tables beside us to hear, "Mark is more of a father than you ever were." There was no hesitation, no tremble of uncertainty. Just a clean, practiced delivery, as if she'd been waiting for the perfect moment to release the line she'd been rehearsing. And what struck me most wasn't her voice, but the silence that followed, the kind that stretches so far you can hear your own heartbeat thudding in your ears while everyone else waits to see how you'll react. My ex-wife didn't blink. She didn't shift, didn't clear her throat, didn't even pretend to soften what had just been dropped into my lap like a lit match. She just smiled, an absent, approving sort of smile that made me feel like I was watching the final paperwork of my own emotional eviction being signed. She looked proud, almost relieved, as though this declaration had confirmed something she'd been planting for years. I remember sitting there, palms sweating against the linen napkin, wondering how long she'd waited for someone else, even our daughter, to deliver the kind of blow she could pretend she had nothing to do with. It's strange. The way heartbreak hits harder when the person delivering it has half your face, your laugh from 10 years ago, and the same nervous habit of twirling a fork when they're unsure of themselves. Except tonight, she wasn't unsure. She was confident, comfortable, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't just losing influence. I had already lost the narrative. I didn't defend myself, not because I didn't have words, but because the moment didn't feel like mine to interrupt. You don't interrupt a performance, especially not when you're the one being written out of the script. Instead, I took a slow sip of water and felt it stick somewhere in my throat as I forced out a smile that felt foreign on my face. "Glad he's helping," I said, even though the words tasted like rust. My daughter nodded, taking that as acceptance. My ex-wife shifted her wine glass and murmured something about how it takes real fathers to step up. I can still feel the heat creeping up my neck, not anger exactly, more like a slow, humiliating burn that reminded me how small I had allowed myself to become for their comfort. I wanted to stand up, say something, reclaim something, anything. But instead, I paid the bill, added dessert for the table like a man clinging to the last scraps of dignity he still believed counted for something, and watched them leave without so much as a backward glance. The waitress gave me this sympathetic half-smile, the kind strangers give when they witness a moment they know wasn't meant to be public. I hated that smile nearly as much as I hated myself for earning it. When I drove home, the steering wheel felt stiff in my hands, as if it, too, had judged me for staying silent. The road blurred in places where my eyes welled, though I refused to let the tears fall because somehow that felt like admitting defeat in a battle I didn't even know I was fighting until I'd already lost. I replayed the dinner over and over, the tone of her voice, the way she didn't look up from her plate, the quiet satisfaction in my ex-wife's expression, and each replay cut a little deeper. I thought about the years after the divorce, the weekends I tried to make meaningful even when she seemed distracted, the birthdays where I stood in the background while her stepdad took the credit, and the countless moments I swallowed resentment because I believed being the bigger person meant being endlessly patient. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe patience looks a lot like permission when viewed from the outside. And maybe, without realizing it, I'd trained them to believe there would always be more of me to take. The house felt too large when I walked in, like the walls echoed with the version of fatherhood I had tried to build and failed to protect. I threw my keys on the counter, sat in the dark, and listened to the refrigerator hum because the silence felt hostile. There, in that dim kitchen, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't angry at my daughter. I was angry at myself. For letting the line between love and obligation blur until she could no longer see me as anything but a source, a backup, a placeholder. That dinner was not the beginning of that story. It was merely the first time it had been spoken out loud. Children don't just wake up one day and rewrite their relationships. They absorb the stories they're given. And I had been letting someone else tell mine for far too long. By the time I went upstairs, something inside me had shifted. Not snapped, not broken, but settled into a colder, clearer shape. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew something had to change, something permanent, something unmistakable. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a decision had already begun forming in me, quiet and heavy, like a storm gathering just out of sight. And once it reached me fully, there would be no taking it back. I woke the next morning with that same dull heaviness in my chest, the kind that didn't let me forget the night before even for a moment. It clung to me like a fog, lingering on my clothes, my voice, even the way I moved around the kitchen as if my limbs had been weighed down during sleep. I kept replaying my daughter's words with an obsessive precision, dissecting every syllable, every pause, every casual flick of her eyes as if, from the right angle, I might uncover some hidden softness I missed in the moment. But the truth didn't change. She meant it, meant every bit of it. And what stung even more was the realization that she probably thought she was simply stating a fact, nothing cruel or monumental. I remember pouring myself coffee and watching the steam curl upward, thinking how strange it was that such a simple gesture could still feel grounding when the rest of my life suddenly felt so weightless, as if the ground had shifted sometime during the night and I was only now noticing the imbalance. By mid-morning, I found myself sitting in my car outside the estate planner's office, staring at the brick building with an odd sense of detachment. I hadn't planned this meeting. There was no appointment on the books. I just drove. My hand moved with its own intention when I reached for the door handle, and before I had fully processed what I was doing, I was stepping into the quiet lobby that smelled faintly of leather and old paper. It felt almost ceremonial, like walking into a chapel for a confession I hadn't rehearsed but needed to deliver. My estate planner, a patient man named Whitaker who'd been handling my finances for years, looked mildly surprised when I appeared in his doorway. "Did we schedule something?" he asked, but not unkindly. I shook my head, took a seat, and said, "I need to make some changes." He didn't push, didn't pry. Instead, he simply nodded and opened a folder as though he'd been expecting this moment all along. Maybe he had. Maybe people like him can sense when a client has reached a breaking point long before the client admits it themselves. Explaining my decision felt strange, not dramatic, not vengeful, just necessary. I told him I wanted to rewrite everything. The house, the accounts, the investments, the savings. All of it was to go to charity. Not to my daughter, not to my ex-wife, not to any remaining family members who had long stopped checking in unless they needed something. "Are you sure?" he asked, and his tone held no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement that this kind of change didn't happen without emotional gravity behind it. I nodded slowly and said the words aloud, words I had never imagined myself saying. "I don't want anything going to people who don't see value in the person giving it." It felt heavier than I expected, like signing a document that severed me from the version of myself I had spent years pretending still existed. Whitaker, to his credit, didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He simply walked me through the paperwork with a steady professionalism that made the whole experience feel more grounded than the emotional storm underneath it. When the pen left the page after the final signature, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't relief exactly, but a kind of clarity, like standing at the top of a hill after a long climb and seeing the landscape finally come into view. I realized then how much of my life had been shaped by trying to maintain a connection that had already been fraying for years. I thought about the weekends my daughter canceled because she forgot. We planned something, the holidays rearranged because her stepdad had other ideas, and the quiet way my role had been shrinking until I was little more than a polite inconvenience. And yet I still clung to the belief that my presence, my support, my constancy meant something more than the occasional thank you text or half-hearted hug. If anything, rewriting the will wasn't an act of revenge, but an act of acknowledgement, a way of admitting that I couldn't keep pretending things were fine simply because I wanted them to be. The hours after I left the office were strangely quiet. My phone buzzed a few times, work emails, automated reminders, nothing personal. And I found myself ignoring them without guilt. I went home, made a simple lunch, and sat at the table staring out the window at the yard I had spent years maintaining. I used to picture my daughter's future here, imagined her bringing friends over, imagined her laughing on the back porch with me the way she used to when she was smaller, and the world felt kinder and less complicated. Now all of those imagined futures felt like someone else's memories, borrowed from a life that never fully belonged to me. The distance between what I hoped for and what actually existed had grown too wide. That afternoon, I opened an old journal I hadn't touched in years, leather-bound, edges worn from the brief period when I believed writing would help me figure out how to be a good divorced father. Back then, the entries were full of plans and promises and reflections that now felt painfully naive. Still, I started writing again. Not because I had answers, but because I needed to witness my own thoughts in ink instead of letting them swirl unchecked in my mind. I wrote about the dinner, the silence, the way her words felt like confirmation of a suspicion I had been too afraid to name, that in her world, I had already been replaced long before she voiced it. I wrote about how guilt had shaped so many of my decisions. Guilt for the divorce, guilt for not being there every night, guilt for every moment I couldn't fix the things that broke between us. Somewhere along the line, guilt had turned into obligation, and obligation had turned into expectation, and expectation had turned into resentment. Writing it out felt like peeling back layers I'd been ignoring for too long. Even as I wrote, a part of me wondered how long it would take for someone, my ex-wife, my daughter, a lawyer, someone, to notice the changes in the will. I knew it would surface eventually. Money has a way of revealing truth faster than any conversation ever does. But for the rest of that day, there was silence. No calls, no messages, no hints of the storm that would inevitably come. And in that quiet, for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to control, thin, fragile, but real. The kind of control that comes not from power, but from finally choosing to stop bleeding for people who never noticed the wound. What I didn't know then was that my silence, my sudden stillness, wouldn't remain unnoticed for long. People who depend on you always feel the shift the moment you stop giving. And mine, well, they were about to feel it in ways they never saw coming. The silence lasted 2 days, 48 hours in which I lived inside a strange calmness that felt both unnatural and overdue. I went to work, responded only to necessary emails, cooked simple meals, and deliberately avoided anything that reminded me of the dinner or the years leading up to it. But silence has weight, and by the second night it had become heavy enough that it pressed against the walls of my house, nudging the air into something tense and expectant. I knew, deep down, that quiet never lasts long when money is involved. Still, I wasn't prepared for the way it ended, a frantic pounding at my front door that rattled the hinges and sliced through the stillness like a warning bell. When I opened the door, my daughter stood there. Eyes red, breathing uneven, her face twisted in a blend of hurt and outrage that didn't belong to the confused child I once knew, but to someone who believed she had been wronged in ways she hadn't yet learned to understand. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, brushing past me with a forcefulness that startled me. "Why would you do that?" she snapped, her voice trembling, but not with sadness, with fury. I closed the door slowly, taking in her appearance, wondering how long she had been crying before she decided to come here. She paced the living room with restless energy, fingers shaking as she pushed her hair back. "Why would you change your will? Why would you cut me out like that?" Her words came rapid fire, leaving no room for breath, no space for consideration. I wanted to ask how she knew so quickly, but the answer was obvious. My ex-wife must have discovered the update in some financial document, or perhaps she had access to something I'd forgotten to revoke. Either way, the speed with which the information traveled told me that the shock wasn't just mine anymore. The ground had shifted beneath them too, and they were scrambling to get their footing. I took a slow breath before responding, trying to steady myself because the last thing I wanted was to make this moment uglier than it already was. I made a decision, I said, keeping my voice calm, though I felt anything but calm. A decision about my own legacy, about what I want done with what I've earned. She stopped pacing and turned toward me with an expression that felt like a slap. Disbelief mixed with entitlement, a look that said she had always assumed the future was hers to inherit, no matter how she treated the present. "You're punishing me," she said, her voice cracking. "You're doing this because of one thing I said." One mistake. The words "one mistake" echoed in my mind, and I felt a sting I wasn't expecting. Because it wasn't just one mistake. It was the culmination of years of distance, dismissiveness, and quiet erosion of a bond one had been clinging to with tired hands. But I didn't say that, not yet. Instead, I said quietly, it wasn't just the comment. It was what it meant. Before she could respond, another knock, sharper, more controlled, filled the doorway. My ex-wife let herself in as if it were still her home, as if time had never passed between us. She scanned the room, locking eyes with me in a way that felt like an accusation before she even spoke. "We need to talk," she said, and there was no softness in her tone, no attempt at diplomacy. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she still held influence over me, someone who assumed the moral high ground belonged to her by default. She walked toward my daughter and placed a hand on her back, guiding her to sit, as though orchestrating a scene she had rehearsed. "This isn't right," my ex-wife said, shifting her attention to me. "You changing your will like that. You know how this makes you look." The irony nearly made me laugh. How it made me look? For years I had endured subtle narratives she wove about me, stories told in quiet corners of conversations I was never invited to. And now the moment I took a step to reclaim something for myself, suddenly my image mattered to her. I sat down across from them, feeling strangely detached, as if watching a play where the actors had memorized their lines but forgotten the point of the story. "I'm not discussing my decisions with either of you," I said calmly. "It's done." My daughter's eyes widened with shock. She wasn't used to boundaries coming from me. My ex-wife's mouth tightened. "You're hurting her," she said, leaning forward as if appealing to some version of me she remembered. "She's your daughter. You owe her something." That word, "oh," hit me harder than anything they'd said so far. I felt a slow, steady heat rise in my chest, not anger, exactly, but recognition. This was the story they'd built, that my value wasn't in who I was, but in what I provided. And the moment I stopped providing, I became a villain. "I don't owe her a legacy," I replied quietly. "A legacy is earned by love and respect, not assumed." My daughter's face crumpled then, but not with understanding, with offense. She stood abruptly, tears streaming again, and said, "You don't even care about me. You're just bitter. Selfish." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment I saw the child she once was, the one who used to hug me fiercely before running off to play. But the moment passed too quickly, swallowed by the resentment she had learned to nurture. I felt something inside me fracture in a different way, not from pain, but from clarity. I realized then that she didn't see the years I tried, didn't remember the sacrifices, didn't value the presence I offered even when it was inconvenient. All she saw was what she expected to receive someday, and now that it was gone, she viewed me not as a person but as a promise broken. My ex-wife crossed her arms and said, "You need to rethink this. We're giving you a chance to fix it before it becomes something more complicated." Her tone carried the same authoritative note she used during our marriage, the one that made decisions feel like ultimatums. But I wasn't that man anymore, not the one she could manipulate with disappointment or redirect with anger. I stood slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. "There's nothing to fix," I said. You taught her that my worth was negotiable. Now I'm simply stepping away from the negotiation. My ex-wife stared at me, stunned for the first time that evening. My daughter let out a soft, wounded sound, like she didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. They left eventually, my daughter storming out in fresh tears, my ex-wife trailing behind her with a look of frustrated calculation. When the door closed, the silence that returned wasn't peaceful. It pulsed with the echoes of everything said, everything lost, and everything coming next. For a long while I stood there, staring at the empty hallway, aware that the line I had drawn would not be left alone. I thought the worst was over. I didn't realize they were only just beginning. The days following their visit felt surreal, almost suspended, as if time had slowed just enough to let every conflicted thought swirl without direction. I kept moving, going to work, taking short walks around the neighborhood, trying to sleep through the restless nights, but nothing felt quite real. It was as though my life had become a room I was observing rather than living in, watching myself drift through routines while my mind replayed the confrontation again and again. I kept hearing my daughter's voice, "You don't even care about me," echoing like a verdict I hadn't known I was being tried for. And beneath that, a quieter, more painful truth lingered. She believed every word she'd said. That's what haunted me, the way certainty sat in her tone. There was no confusion, no doubt, just conviction shaped by years of subtle influence I hadn't seen until it was too late. Even so, part of me hoped the worst of it had passed, that we would drift apart quietly now, settling into some distant, uneasy acceptance. But life rarely cooperates with quiet endings, especially not when pride and resentment have already slipped into the room. It was 3 days after the confrontation when the twist arrived, not with another knock at my door or a storm of angry messages, but with a simple phone call from someone I hadn't heard from in months. His name was Daniel, an old family friend who had known my ex-wife and me long before divorce, long before remarriage, long before my daughter learned how to build walls with words she barely understood. He was one of the few people who had stayed neutral through the separation, never choosing sides, never weaponizing information. So when his name flashed on my phone, I hesitated, not out of dread, but because I sensed immediately that he wasn't calling for something casual. "Hey," he said when I answered, his voice carrying that cautious tone people use when they aren't sure how fragile the person on the other end might be. "Listen, I heard something I think you should know." His words were slow, careful, as if he were placing each one on fragile ground. I leaned back in my chair, already bracing for something unwelcome. He told me he'd been at a mutual friend's gathering a few nights earlier, the same night my daughter had confronted me, where my ex-wife and her husband had apparently shown up with my daughter in tow. According to him, the conversation had turned toward parents and teenagers, and someone had jokingly asked my daughter if she ever gave her real dad a break. Daniel hesitated as he reached that part of the story, and I could practically feel the weight of what was coming through the phone. Then he said it plainly. My daughter had laughed, and told the group that she didn't think of me as her real father anymore. That her stepdad was the one who actually shows up, and that I was mostly just a wallet. The words hit me harder than the dinner comment ever had. Maybe because this time I knew she hadn't said it out of impulsive teenage irritation or in the heat of confrontation. She'd said it casually, socially, in a room full of people, as though I were an outdated accessory she'd outgrown. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as Daniel spoke, his voice thick with discomfort, like he wished he hadn't been put in the position to repeat it. He went on, slowly, reluctantly, telling me that my ex-wife had joined in the conversation, laughing lightly as if the joke had been harmless. She reportedly told the group that I had always sort of floated in and out, and that my daughter had long learned she couldn't rely on me emotionally. Hearing that felt like being cut open with a dull blade, slow, dragging, unnecessarily cruel. Because it wasn't just untrue, it was a deliberate rewriting of history, a narrative sculpted over years to justify their distance, their choices, their entitlement. And the worst part was that my daughter believed it. She had accepted it, internalized it, repeated it as her own truth. The realization hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I hadn't simply been drifting from her. I had been pushed, quietly, consistently, with expert precision by someone who knew exactly how to turn absence into accusation. My ex-wife had always been subtle in the way she shaped stories, careful never to leave fingerprints, but the final product had been the same. She had remade me in my daughter's eyes into a man unworthy of affection, unworthy of loyalty, unworthy of even basic respect. After Daniel finished speaking, there was a long silence on the line, the kind that forms when two people are grieving something they can't quite name. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry. I thought you should hear it from someone who isn't trying to hurt you." I thanked him, though the words felt thin and inadequate. When the call ended, I sat perfectly still, as if any movement might shatter what little composure I had left. It wasn't just the betrayal that broke me, it was the clarity. For so long I'd wondered if maybe I was exaggerating the distance, if maybe the coldness I felt was more about me than her. But now, hearing that she spoke about me like a distant inconvenience, like some financial apparatus rather than a parent, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. She didn't just see me as less, she saw me as replaceable. And my ex-wife had helped carve that belief into her, chiseling away at whatever bond we'd once shared until only a hollow outline remained. I spent the rest of the day wandering around my house, moving from room to room without purpose, touching objects I'd forgotten held sentimental weight, photos, small crafts my daughter made in elementary school, the Father's Day card she once gave me with crooked handwriting, and a drawing of us holding hands. I stared at that card for a long time, tracing the lines with my thumb, wondering when the shift had happened. When had I gone from being the man she proudly drew to the man she dismissed so easily in public? When had love been replaced with embarrassment, gratitude with expectation? And why had I been the only one trying to hold the threads together while everyone else seemed so willing to let them fray? That question lodged itself in my chest, heavy and unresolved, because I knew the answer wasn't simple. Maybe it wasn't one moment, but hundreds of small ones. Missed chances, manipulated narratives, unspoken resentments that had piled up until the foundation cracked. It should have been enough to break me completely, and in a way it did. But beneath the hurt, beneath the grief, something else took shape, something steadier, colder, clearer than anything I'd felt before. Knowing the truth didn't weaken my resolve, it crystallized it. I saw the situation for what it was, and I understood, finally, that no gesture, no amount of money, no desperate effort to prove myself would undo years of conditioning. My daughter didn't just drift away, she was guided. And I had been too blind, too hopeful, too willing to play the quiet, accommodating father to notice what was being taken from me inch by inch. For the first time, I wondered if I had ever truly had a place in her life at all. Or if I had simply held on to the illusion because the truth was too painful to face. And the worst part was knowing that the real fallout hadn't even begun. In the days after Daniel's call, I carried a strange stillness inside me, the kind that doesn't come from peace but from exhaustion, an emotional numbness that settles in only when you've run out of explanations to offer and wounds to reopen. I kept replaying what he'd told me, not because I wanted to torture myself, but because the repetition forced clarity onto a truth I had avoided for too long. My daughter didn't just misunderstand me. She genuinely believed a version of me that had been constructed deliberately, piece by piece, until it became more real to her than anything I had ever shown her. And my ex-wife, well, she had become the curator of that narrative, sculpting my absence in places where I had always been present, minimizing my efforts until even the memories themselves felt warped. Yet even with that clarity, I didn't expect the betrayal to spread beyond private conversations. I didn't expect strangers, acquaintances, distant relatives to suddenly have opinions about a story they had only heard secondhand. But the internet has a way of turning whispers into megaphones, and the next escalation arrived faster and louder than anything before it. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was drinking coffee, scrolling through emails, when a cousin I barely spoke to sent me a message that began with, "Are you okay? Have you seen what you posted?" My stomach tightened before I even opened the link. It led to my ex-wife's social media, an account I hadn't checked in years, and there, displayed in clean, self-righteous typography, was a long post about parents who abandon their children emotionally and hide behind financial excuses. She didn't mention my name, but she didn't have to. She described details specific enough that anyone who knew us even loosely would understand. She framed herself as the struggling, devoted mother, framed her husband as the stable, loving father figure, and framed me as the distant biological parent who had chosen ego over family, money over connection. My daughter had commented beneath it with a simple heart emoji, followed by, "Thank you for always telling the truth, Mom." And that, more than anything, made the breath leave my lungs. The comments were a wildfire. People who hadn't seen me in years chimed in with sympathetic platitudes, offering prayers and praise, while others dissected my failures as if they had been present for every moment of my life. A few even speculated that maybe I was dangerous or unstable, because that's what people do online. They escalate a problem until it becomes a caricature of the original pain. I sat there reading every line, my hands going cold, realizing this wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore. This was a public indictment, a rewriting of my character delivered to an audience who would never hear my side because I had never been one to broadcast my private life. My ex-wife understood that. She knew that by the time I saw the post, the narrative would have already taken root. And she knew, because she had once been married to me, that I wouldn't retaliate with my own post, or story, or defense. She played a game she knew I wouldn't join, and that was what made it sting most sharply. But shock eventually hardened into something else, resolve. I didn't respond online. I refused to feed the fire. Instead, I drove to their house later that afternoon, compelled not by revenge, but by the need to reclaim my own voice directly from the people who had taken it. I rehearsed what I might say as I walked to the door, though the script dissolved the moment my daughter opened it. She looked startled, then defensive, as if she had expected me to yell, to accuse, to plead. But my voice came out calm, too calm, the kind of calm that made her eyes dart nervously toward the living room where her mother was sitting. When my ex-wife appeared in the doorway, her expression was a mask of practiced concern, the kind she wore whenever she had already positioned herself as the victim. She didn't invite me in, but she didn't tell me to leave either. She stood there waiting, arms crossed, braced for confrontation. "I saw your post," I said simply. My ex-wife lifted her chin, offering a look of wounded justification. "I didn't name you," she replied, as if that absolved her. I took a slow breath, reminding myself not to be dragged into the emotional traps she excelled at setting. "You didn't have to," I said, "but you didn't tell the truth either." My daughter crossed her arms in a mirrored gesture, and for a moment, the resemblance between them, not physical but emotional, hit me like a punch. My ex-wife launched into a rehearsed explanation, talking about how she had shared her feelings and spoken from the heart, and how she couldn't control how people interpreted it. But the calmness inside me held. I interrupted her gently but firmly. It's not interpretation when it's designed to mislead. The conversation that followed wasn't a shouting match. It was worse. It was a measured excavation of years of unspoken resentment. My ex-wife accused me of being unreliable, distant, uninvolved. I countered with facts: birthdays attended, bills paid, plans rearranged, promises kept. My daughter's face shifted uneasily when she heard the specifics, but her mother quickly intervened, reframing each example as superficial or forced. It became clear that this wasn't just a disagreement, it was a belief system. My daughter truly believed her mother's version of events, not because she had weighed both sides, but because she had been raised inside one narrative for so long that she couldn't recognize another. When I mentioned the will, my ex-wife scoffed, calling it petty, vengeful, childish. "A father should provide," she said sharply. "Always." And that word hit me again, provide, as though that were my role, my identity, my purpose. Not to be loved, or respected, or valued, but to provide. Something inside me snapped then, not with anger, but with comprehension. I realized that no explanation I offered would shift their belief. The story had been written too deeply into them. So I stopped defending myself. I stood there and let the weight of the moment settle before I said quietly, "I have given everything I know how to give, and all it's done is teach you to expect more." My daughter blinked, her expression flickering with something. Confusion, maybe, or the earliest edges of understanding. But my ex-wife stepped in front of her, shielding her from the vulnerability of reflection. "Don't come here again," she said coldly. "If you're going to act like this, you're not welcome." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood something I should have realized long ago. That was the moment I knew exactly what I had to do next. And this time, I wouldn't hesitate. In the days after that final confrontation at their house, something inside me settled in a way I hadn't felt in years, a kind of stillness that wasn't numbness, but clarity. The truth of the situation had finally crystallized into something undeniable. I had spent years trying to father a child inside a narrative I had no control over, pouring effort into a relationship her mother had already vandalized long before I realized what was happening. Holding on had become its own form of self-harm, a slow erosion of my confidence, my dignity, my sense of who I was supposed to be. And once I truly saw that, once I understood the depth of what had been lost, the decision I needed to make didn't feel dramatic or vengeful. It felt necessary, like finally stepping out of a burning room after pretending the flames were manageable. I woke one morning with a steadiness in my breathing I hadn't felt in years, and without hesitation, I began making arrangements to close every remaining door that kept me tethered to expectations I could never fulfill. The first step was financial, not because money mattered more than anything else, but because money had become the weapon they wielded whenever they wanted to remind me of my role. I met with Whitaker again, this time with no hesitation, no second-guessing, no lingering guilt. I finalized every remaining detail of the will, tightened the language, updated beneficiaries, and ensured that nothing could be contested later. I transferred the charitable allocations into irrevocable structures, permanently sealing what I had already decided. Then I ended all recurring financial support that had continued quietly in the background, auto payments, tuition assistance, car maintenance funds. Not out of spite, but because I was done financing a narrative in which I was cast as the villain regardless of my contributions. When Whitaker asked if I was sure, I felt the words settle heavy and certain on my tongue. I'm done building a future for people who resent me. And for the first time in years, I meant every syllable. The second step was the emotional severing, the part people assume is impulsive but actually requires more strength than anger ever could. I sat at my dining table, the same one my daughter used to do homework on, and wrote a letter addressed to her. Not an angry letter, not a plea for understanding, but a clear and quiet explanation. I told her I loved her, but love cannot survive where respect has died. I told her I would no longer ask for space in a life where I was treated like a placeholder. I told her that adulthood would teach her many things, and one day she might look back with different eyes. But whether she did or didn't, I wished her peace. And then, gently but firmly, I told her I was stepping away, not just from the role she never wanted me to fill, but from the expectation that I should continue offering pieces of myself to people who had already discarded them. The letter wasn't a goodbye. It was a boundary she'd never thought I was capable of drawing. I sent the letter by certified mail so I wouldn't be accused of disappearing without explanation. I knew it would arrive within a day or two. I didn't expect gratitude or reconciliation or even acknowledgement. I just wanted the truth to be written in my own words for once, not filtered through the revisions of people who needed me to be the problem. And as I sealed the envelope, a surprising calm washed over me. Not triumph. There was nothing victorious about letting go of your child. But peace, the kind that comes from finally choosing not to lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who never extended a hand back. The fallout arrived faster than expected. My ex-wife called first, her number flashing across my phone again and again until it became background noise. She left voicemails layered with anger and disbelief, accusing me of abandonment, selfishness, emotional cruelty, every projection she'd perfected over the years. I didn't respond. Then the tone shifted. The messages turned pleading, then desperate, then accusing again. She needed me to re-engage because without me playing my assigned role, the entire story she'd built began to collapse in on itself. People noticed the shift. The online posts that once painted her as a martyr started attracting uncomfortable questions. A few relatives reached out to me privately, curious, confused, or quietly supportive. But I stayed silent, not out of spite, but because I had learned that explanations only work on people willing to listen. My daughter's reaction arrived on a quiet Saturday afternoon, a short text that blinked onto my screen like a flare shot into the dark. "I got your letter. I don't understand how you can just walk away." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling its weight. She had expected anger. She had expected me to chase her, to fight for a place in her life that she had repeatedly denied me. She hadn't expected indifference, but it wasn't indifference I felt. It was acceptance. The painful kind, the matured kind, the kind forged only when all other options have already been exhausted. I typed a short reply, measured, calm, simple. "I'm walking away because holding on was killing me. I hope you find what I couldn't give you." She never responded. The days that followed felt strangely open, like I'd been carrying a weight so long that my body didn't know how to stand without compensating for it. I started spending evenings in silence, not the hollow kind that once echoed with regret, but a new kind, an intentional quiet that wasn't hiding anything beneath it. I took long walks. I began a woodworking project I'd abandoned years earlier. I reconnected with small pieces of myself that had been waiting patiently for my return. There was grief, of course. You don't let go of a child without feeling the edges of that loss cut into you. But there was also something else, something peaceful, something honest, something like healing. And in that stillness, I realized something important. I hadn't lost them. I had simply stopped holding on to people who had already let go of me long before I noticed. That was the boundary, and this time it held. If you've ever had to choose your own peace over people who didn't value you, share your experience in the comments below. And if this story hits somewhere deep, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that cut close to the heart. See you soon in the next story.